Good afternoon, everyone. I am Maria Cornelius, the president of ETFBJ, and today we welcome Kim Kruesi of the Associated Press and Erik Schelzig of the Tennessee Journal. They are longtime Tennessee Capitol reporters. Needless to say, being a Capitol reporter right now is a very busy and certainly newsworthy job and very vital job, particularly since you do so much work to keep everyone informed at a time when we need as much news as we can get in all formats out of Nashville. I'm going to step aside and let Jesse Maychark moderate this interview. Jesse is the co-owner of The Compass, which covers politics very, very well in Knox County. And also he crosses over because at one time he worked in government for the Knoxville mayor's office. So Jesse wears a lot of hats and is an outstanding reporter, as are Kim and Erik, and I thank you both for being here, and I will step aside and let Jesse get started.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Maria, and thanks to both Kim and Erik for joining us today. I wanted to, I thought that it would be a good time here in November to talk about Statehouse coverage during a sort of rare break, especially this year, although we've actually had an activity up there even just last week. Like there's still a lot going on. But between this kind of crazy last session and what we're anticipating for the coming session starting in January, I'd like to start by asking both of our guests to just introduce yourselves a little bit. Tell us about your background and in particular, how long you've been kind of observing and documenting events there in the state capitol. And Kim, maybe start with you.
Yeah. Hi. Well, thank you for inviting me to talk with y'all. My name is Kimberlee Kruesi. I'm a Statehouse reporter with the Associated Press, and I cover all things Tennessee politics. And I spent a good chunk of that covering the Statehouse. I've been in Nashville for the past 5 years. Before that, I was out west. I'm born and raised Oregonian, but I got my start with AP in 2014 covering the Idaho Statehouse, and I was there for several years. And it's kind of where I first learned how to kind of jump into and caught the bug. And then I had the opportunity to move to Nashville. So that's a little bit about me.
And Erik?
Well, Kim is my successor at the AP at the Tennessee Statehouse. I left the AP about 5 years ago to join the Tennessee Journal, which is a weekly newsletter covering, the inner workings of state government. AP is much more geared at a general audience and an audience that isn't necessarily clued into all things Tennessee, whereas, as by the name of the publication, we focus heavily on the nuts and bolts of what's happening inside the Capitol Dome. I started my journalism career really with the AP in Miami and got sent to West Virginia, where I was supposed to be covering outdoor sports and tourism. And because of a staffing change, there was an opening at the Statehouse, and I was suddenly also became the Statehouse reporter and covered the first gubernatorial election of Joe Manchin, who just, of course, announced this week he's leaving the Senate, and we'll see if that's the end of his political career or not. I got transferred to Nashville in 2005. So this marks 18 years since I've covered the Statehouse. It's been an interesting ride, and I'm sure we'll get more into the excitement down there shortly.
Yeah, well, so let's talk a little bit broadly about this idea of Statehouse reporters and how that's maybe changed a little bit in the time that both of you have been doing it, and both of you have experience in other states in addition to Tennessee. I feel like when I worked at the News Sentinel back in the 1990s, we had our own Statehouse reporters. We had 2 of them in Nashville at the time, and so did, of course, the Tennessean had had a whole crew there. Memphis Commercial Appeal, Chattanooga, like everybody had their own, in addition, of course, to the Associated Press that was there. And that has changed a little bit, right? So I guess what have both of you seen in terms of, on the one hand, I feel like there's been increasing attention to state governments in recent decades, especially as we've had some state governments like Tennessee's taking somewhat aggressive postures, say, toward federal legislation and challenging things in courts and so forth. But at the same time, there's been kind of a reduction in the actual, boots on the ground. What have you both seen in Nashville, say, in the last 10 years?
Kim, go
I'll
ahead.
let Eric start, and then because I've only been here for 5.
Okay, well, I'll start with the long view, and then maybe Kim can do the more recent developments. But yeah, as Jesse pointed out, it's been in the old days, in the good old days, when I first got here, again, nearly 20 years ago, people were talking how great things used to be. And now I've turned into the person who says how great things used to be, albeit much reduced from the previous times. A lot of cities back in the day had AMs and PMs papers, so it wasn't just the morning papers that had people at the State House, it was also the afternoon papers, and that's when competition was the most fierce, between the Nashville Banner and the Nashville Tennessean, or the Chattanooga Times and the News Free Press, as it was called back then, hilariously, and the of course the Knoxville papers and everyone else. So there used to, and also between UPI and AP, so a lot of sort of inner competition to try to beat each other on various beats. As the number of reporters has gone down, and it has with the consolidation of the Gannett newspapers and just everyone else, unfortunately, I feel like there's been more of a sort of circling the wagons among the press corps, and a feeling that to some extent we're all in this together, given there's so many fewer of us. And we're fighting the forces of government that tends to want to keep a lid on things they don't want getting out. I just, shameless self-promotion here, I've just written a book on Tennessee political scandals, called Welcome to Capitol Hill. Check it out at your local bookseller. But as part of doing the research on that, we dug deeply into the news coverage of the State House and the various scandals we were covering over the last 50 years. And it's just an incredible amount of news that was out there about every member of every delegation from around the state that you just don't see anymore. The sort of granular level. I mean, not all of it was the most important and exciting news. So I guess you could argue that a little bit of focusing has taken place, but there has been a loss of sort of eyes on the game that has happened sort of generally over the last 50 years and seems to have accelerated in recent years, except for some new players who have come on the scene in more recent years. And I guess I'll hand off to Kim to sort of detail some of that.
Yeah, so like I said, I've been in Tennessee for 5 years, but I've been covering state houses for nearly a decade now. And Eric's 100% correct. So just there has been a drop in the overall numbers of state house reporters, but I try to remain a little bit of optimistic by seeing these new players. While legacy media is still trying to maybe sort through, count AP through that of like, how do we tackle state house coverage? We have nonprofit online news outlets hiring folks and putting more bodies, inside the press room. And I'm always going to be encouraged by that. But, I think Eric did a really good job of like the big picture of, kind of laying the land over the past 10 years, just like personally, like how I approach my job. I know that when I first started out, I felt such incredible pressure to cover everything and anything as much as I can. And that's really hard to do when you're just by yourself. I moved to Tennessee. I now have my colleague, Jonathan Mattice, help me out, cover the State House, but still 2 people covering a State House is overwhelming. You can't do it. And so I know that I have become a lot more pickier with what I choose to cover, and I try to cover things from a big okay, what's going to be the biggest impact. This is the governor's bill for the session, so we're going to cover the introduction, but we're maybe not going to cover it when it advances out of committee. We're probably not going to return to it until unless some sparks happen, a lawmaker says something that we have to return to it, but we're going to probably return to it when it's back on the Senate House floor, or when it's back to the governor's desk. That's a difference in how I approached it when I initially, and there's always going to be that tension of like, are we missing something? Are we missing copy? But for me, I also kind of go with like, that offers me more freedom to, okay, I covered the big thing of the day. Like, what else can we cover? A little bit more freedom to not be chasing little turns, but chasing bigger stories. Hopefully that's the goal always.
Well, and that gets into, I was going to ask exactly about prioritization for both of you, because Erik, I know you're basically a one-man shop and with the AP, so you have two, and I guess Gannett is relying on just a couple of reporters to kind of feed all of their papers across the state now. I know, especially when it comes to covering the legislature, on the one hand, there's this huge volume of legislation that gets introduced at the beginning of every session, and then it all happens really quickly within just like, 3 or 4 months, everything kind of happens. How do you decide, because a lot of times there's those kind of like attention getting bills that maybe make good headlines, but you also kind of know because of who's sponsoring it or the committee it has to go to that it's maybe not going to get a lot of traction, even though everybody's talking about it on Facebook or whatever. How do you prioritize on a day-to-day basis? Like, I'm going to focus on this particular issue. This is the thing that people need or want to know about most today or this week.
I'll start. I consider myself very lucky to work with AP's Statehouse team, where we're already currently talking about, like, across the country, what are the major themes entering into 2024, and we identify our top, some of them that we're talking about, across the country is going to be democracy, how lawmakers are protecting, undermining it across the country, looking at LGBTQ plus rights, looking at reproductive rights access, but also looking at crime and criminal justice reforms. And so we identify some of these large themes that we know have. I work for a national outlet, so I'm looking for national interest. But you, as you said, like, what could be a talker on Facebook versus like what has legs. There's always going to be that tension. I know for me, I'm very picky about. I don't usually write about a bill until it's actually been introduced. When a lawmaker says, "Well, I'm going to introduce this bill," or has filed it, I like to give it some breathing room to say, okay, well, anyone can say they're going to file a bill. Let's see what actually happens with it. Pros and cons. I can see why having a conversation about that, but I think that's one way to kind of tampen down of, because you could just chase headlines all day long. I'm also very, if where the crowd is, chasing the shiny thing, it's always like, okay, well, maybe we have that covered. Maybe let's see what else, we haven't seen. Or, I love relying on my Statehouse colleagues from across the country, because you can identify the same bills, same themes that are going on. Very rarely is Tennessee like coming up, reinventing the wheel. Like, usually we have groups lobbying arms that are introducing bills, in multiple states and throwing spaghetti against the wall just to see what works. So that's good to rely on that network, also to kind of figuring out, all right, this isn't just happening in Tennessee. Being able to identify trends is, and what's happening elsewhere, I think can be very important, to the public.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess I would echo Kim's approach to a large extent. I mean, the problem is, I try to, not chase the shiny object until it becomes too shiny to ignore,
I chase the shiny things.
Of course, right? No, it's just, it's impossible at some level when people and then other people start taking notice and say, why didn't we have this? And then everyone has to scramble. We had our longtime, it might predate Kim, but Tom Humphrey was the longtime Statehouse correspondent for the Knoxville News Sentinel. And he took great delight in mocking his colleagues every time somebody would write a story about a bill that had been introduced. He goes, "There's a bill," he'd say, and sort of laugh at us. And, this is the natural season. We all get, and then it was all fine and good until, of course, he himself would write a "There's a bill" story, and in which, in his esteemed judgment, it was worth pursuing, which it probably was, right? But it's one of those things where it's easy to sort of dismiss everything, and then suddenly you have to chase the big item. From my perspective, the hardest part about the legislative session is drinking from the fire hose. I mean, there's so much going on. Every committee is meeting in different rooms, and we try to monitor it on video or on, a lot of times more often on video now than in person, just because you can try to do more than one committee at a time, and really try to keep an eye out for things that are unusual or out of the ordinary, and especially for my purposes of the inside baseball approach. During this last session, we had big debate over exemptions to the new abortion ban that had gone into place. And Richard Briggs from Knoxville was one of the people raising concerns that essentially for physicians, this was creating a standard of presuming doctors guilty unless they could prove themselves innocent of having terminated a pregnancy due to the health or life of the mother. In one committee meeting, there was a debate about the proposed changes, and the Right to Life representative was sort of scolding lawmakers for trying to do this. And Speaker Cameron Sexton, came down to the committee and basically read him the riot act and was, a very strong sort of rebuke of this guy in committee. How dare you threaten us, kind of thing, which is highly unusual in the legislative process. And that became the sort of overarching, thing in the journal about how this is the use or attempted use of speaker's power to sort of override a strong lobbying interest, a special interest, and getting into the roots of that. Of course, I couldn't have planned for that because I didn't know it was going to happen. I just had to see it, or a lot of times have someone tell me, "Hey, did you see X, Y, and Z committee where so and so did such and such?" And then I try to go back and watch it and reconstruct it. And yeah, it's I wish I could say it was more scientific than that, but a lot of times it's sort of it when you see it kind of thing, and what fits into the publication or aims that we have. Now, I don't have a delegation that I follow closely. I think if I was covering the news for East Tennessee from East Tennessee, like I might have a different approach because there's issues that are unique and interesting to the people of that region or city or wherever you are. But it's from a general approach. It's just sometimes and then sometimes we miss things. Later on, like that was a big deal, and we should have gone back and done more. And then you try to catch up. And the good news is nothing at the legislature is really ever dead, so you can always come back to it. Issues get reprised, and things happen again and again. So again,
The scariest thing you can do is just declare a bill dead because then it will come back surely the next week.
It's true.
Yeah, I had that experience when I worked for the city of Knoxville, and part of my job was, sort of doing liaison with our lobbyist in Nashville, which was Tony Thompson. You guys probably know. And we had that experience with a couple of bills, because a lot of times being the city of Knoxville in the current legislature, we were playing a lot more defense than offense. And we had just that horror movie zombie experience several times where it's like, it's finally dead. And then, the hand shoots up from the grave. And it's like, oh. Well, but so in terms of just trying to follow all of that and understand what's going on. I know our legislature prides itself on, they say, being very transparent. They have a website with a lot of information on it, and they have made some changes to that, even just in the last session with having amendments available maybe before the hearing instead of after it, and those kinds of things. Like, how do you grade the actual openness and transparency of state government and the legislature as you're trying to cover it? How easy or hard is it to just find out what the actual proposal is, like what some particular group is trying to do? Because I know there can be this bit of cat and mouse game where, you don't see the bill until the last possible minute, and then it kind of gets pushed through.
I'll jump in, Kim. There is a lot of sort of what I'd call, I don't know, it is transparent. Like the bills are all there, and the amendments, especially on the House side, are now being posted before committees or before they're adopted. But it's very much an issue of sort of hide the ball a lot of times. So many bills get filed as caption bills, as they call them, where it basically opens a certain title of the code, but doesn't really say what it does until that amendment is filed. And a lot of times those will just get dropped sort of under the cover of darkness and just appear in a committee, and suddenly everyone's scrambling. So yeah, the information is there, but I think there could be a lot more sort of dedication on behalf of officials to be transparent about what it is they're trying to accomplish, as opposed to just having a bill in reserve that could do all kinds of things. And then later on, when you look back at a major bill that got passed, and you find the original version that, just has a generic title like opens chapter 56 of the code and whatever, and then it took on a whole new different life. The filing of the amendments thing has been a big struggle for forever, really, since I've been down there and before, where lawmakers have this thing called the dashboard, where they have iPads and they have all the information about the bills on their iPads, including sort of red line language, like, what's being taken out of the code and what's being added in under the changes, that the public has never traditionally had access to. The House has tried to sort of institute that. It's still pretty clunky, and you got to log into a site. You got to sort of know where to look, and the Senate has just refused. So, it's there isn't exactly an arms race for transparency going on, and it feels a little bit more like people doing as little as necessary to keep the sort of public from getting too angry about the whole thing. And I'd say the record is pretty middling.
Mhm.
Yeah, just to add to that, as a public records lover, the legislature has exempted itself from the Public Records Act. So you cannot FOIA or request their emails, memos, text messages to each other. That is not every state is like that. I can't off the top of my head, I can't say if it's an outlier, but it does make things more challenging when you are trying to understand how a lawmaker was who he or she were discussing a certain topic, legislation with, who was lobbying them, who were they taking meetings from, input, talking points. That's just a huge thing that's just hidden. Likewise, the House GOP caucus now has largely closed their caucus meetings from the press. When just 5 years ago, when I was here, the press could largely go to those caucus meetings. And in a span of 5 years, that went from being open to now we kind of know when they're meeting afterwards, but not really. And the only other thing I would add to this about, yes, bills are posted, that I feel like the amendments are getting better, but you can still, especially on contentious bills, that there's maybe a hint of a lawsuit going to be coming after session if the bill is passed. Usually you'll see often Democrats asking Republican sponsors hypotheticals or understand like the true impact of a bill. And you will see the sponsor just read either the language from the bill or refuse to basically say how this bill will actually impact the public, how it will actually be implemented. And that is just, it just really increased over the past 5 years, because usually they know that what they say is going to be used as a legislative record in a lawsuit if this is a particular contentious bill. But that it can be very difficult as someone from the public trying to understand the impact or why a bill is coming forth. I'm remembering the critical race theory ban. Multiple Democratic sponsors were asking, how would this apply? How would this apply about talking about the Holocaust? How would this talk about, the civil rights history? And time and time again, Republican lawmakers would largely refuse to actually go down that path of a hypothetical. Now, pros and cons of these are hypotheticals, not real situations, but you can see that there is that frustration that maybe these conversations were taking place behind closed doors, and then while on the House floor, when they're talking about how to implement a bill, they refuse to go down that path. So that can be kind of frustrating from somebody trying to understand what this bill will actually do.
Yeah, real quick, since Kim mentioned the caucus meetings in the House being closed, since I dinged the Senate on the amendments, I'll have to give the Senate credit where Senate rules still require that all caucus meetings remain open to the public, and they do advertise those, and we do regularly attend. So
yes,
score one for the Senate on that one, and -1 on the other. So
that's a good point. Sorry, I was not trying to.
No, I'm just
the Senate there.
Well, and just on that point about the ambiguity in that critical race theory bill, even though, of course, the bill never actually used the phrase critical race theory, but then everybody who voted for it came out and said, we voted against critical race theory. But I'm sure you all saw that story out of Memphis just last week, where there was, this presentation by two journalists who wrote a book about the George Floyd murders, speaking to a group of high school students. And at the last minute, they were told all these things they couldn't talk about their own book that they'd written, and they weren't allowed to give out copies of the book. Not because anybody from the state came and said you can't do this, but because it seems like local officials were just very still wary of that law and what it actually, here we are a few years later, people are still trying to understand what the law actually restricts. And yeah, that kind of ambiguity then can just carry forward into the actual implementation of the law.
There's a
Um,
similar experience on the so-called drag show ban, or the cabaret show ban, where
Yeah.
the lawmakers sort of try to make this whole point that this wasn't in fact a drag ban during the debate, but then on the campaign trail and to other people, they're like, yeah, we banned drag shows. And then when there's lawsuits, the AG has to come in and say, well, none of this stuff that people are trying to ban locally actually does violate the the adult cabaret bill, uh, which sort of raises the question of what the point was in the first place. So, it's interesting seeing the sort of arguments come back to haunt the state when they're trying to mount legal defense or local ordinance or defend local ordinances.
right. Well, let's talk a little bit about this past session, because it was pretty notable. And of course, Kim, I was just thinking, you've been here for 5 years. It's been a pretty busy 5 years in the state capitol, because I guess you showed up in time for the whole Glenn Cassida saga. And then
Yep.
right after that, we went into the pandemic and everything that came out of that. So there's been all this upheaval. And then we came to 2023. And I guess, let's talk about this past session, both before the Covenant school shootings and after. Before that, obviously, really terrible, awful event happened. What was this session like? I mean, had it more or less followed the contours of what you both expected in terms of what the big issues were going to be, and what the political dynamics were going to be? Whoever wants to start.
Well, you have to remember, I mean, Tennessee was the first state. I mean, however you want to frame it, it was the anti-drag bill, and that Tennessee was the first state in the country to pass that. And that was like, at least for me, like a huge story for us right up until March. Tennessee has led the country in passing some of the most anti-LGBTQ plus rights bills. And I think that this was, we had been following the growing concern around drag shows across the state and how to regulate them, whether or not where they should be held. That was a huge conversation. Likewise, this was the abortion exemption fight over whether or not Tennessee's abortion ban should be tweaked at all. And we heard time and time again that the governor and Tennessee saying no, it did not. The minor of changes did occur to that bill, and they're still facing a legal challenge right now over whether or not that bill, that bill is doing enough to protect women who may be facing medical complications. And so that fight's still ongoing. But yes and no. It was not so hard to say whether or not a session is run of the mill, but we had some already very tense, there's tension already happening, and there had been ongoing tension, particularly I feel like there's always going to be more tension in the House. It's just more bodies, more more fireworks, but you had more lingering tension, I think, ever since how you had Democratic lawmakers quite upset over maybe some of the inaction of the 2020 George Floyd protests, being locked at home in COVID. And then, you have, after the 2022 midterm elections, you have new members coming in saying, hey, I'm here to represent constituents who say that they're being ignored. And you had this jolt of Representative Justin Jones coming in hot, and as well as Justin Pearson. They were already causing some eyebrows to raise before everything that exploded after the Covenant shooting. So I think this stuff had been simmering for a while now, and not just for this session, but in the lead up. And so I don't know if Erik agrees with my assessment or not.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it's hard to, whenever the session's going on, and I talk to sort of my neighbors when I'm walking my dog in the morning, like, oh, well, you got a lot to cover down there. I'm like, well, there always is. It's not really new. There's always something. Yeah, I agree with Kim. The early tone was set during the session on the surgery, the gender affirming care bill,
right.
which was Senate Bill number 1, I think, if I recall correctly, and then the drag show bill was Senate Bill number 3. Both of them were sponsored by Senator Jack Johnson, the Senate Majority Leader, who only narrowly survived a primary challenge last fall by a guy who was hitting him on a lot of these social issues things. So, it was interesting to see the sort of hangover from that effect, and Johnson now trying to insulate himself against future attacks by sort of taking these really hardcore social issue stances on things when really traditionally he's been known as more of a pro-business kind of guy. He sort of shed that, or tried to shed that as he's found that that's less politically advantageous to him. The other big thing that sort of dominated early the session was the Republican outrage at Nashville for refusing to host the Republican National Convention. Uh, uh, Basically the mayor and the city council had a document that all they had to do was approve, and the conventional wisdom was the RNC would come here. And then they refused. The RNC decided to go to Milwaukee. So there's a lot of anger about that. And then there was this sort of revenge campaign that occurred with several bills aimed at sort of taking it out on Nashville. The most sort of specific one was trying to cut the size of the National Council from 40 members to 20, which passed, and also taken over the airport authority and the sports authority and the convention board financial stream and various other things. They all sort of happened in rapid succession. They all passed, and then of course have been mired in court, and now all of them are sort of on the ropes legally, or most of them, including the airport bill that just got thrown out late last month, and the council bill was put on hold because it was too close to the election. So it's sort of interesting to see this sort of play out now in the courts, and the general anger over the original incident, the RNC thing, it's kind of faded. Other things have happened and people have moved on to other issues, and there isn't any kind of real statewide uproar that, oh my God, Nashville's not getting the convention, because who cares about that in Knoxville or Memphis or Tri-Cities or anywhere else. So it's interesting how these things sort of work themselves up into a tempest and then kind of fade, and then you're left just sort of holding the bag in court. And I guess at some point we'll have to file some public records request to find out what all this cost. And I'm sure the AG's office won't tell us. But in any event, that's sort of those things and the issues Kim mentioned were sort of circulating during the session. And then of course the shooting happens and the protest happens, and then basically the legislature folded up shop in short order and just sort of ran for the hills, and ended the session sort of within weeks of, I'm trying to remember how quickly it was, but between the ousters of the lawmakers and the shooting itself, like they got out the door in pretty short order.
Well, and so following up on that, I guess, of course, the shooting happened and kind of everybody responded in different ways. And of course, there was immediately this push from some people to try to get the legislature to do something in response. When did you have a sense, as that protest happened with who we now call the Tennessee Three, including Knoxville's own Gloria Johnson, of course. When did you sense that was going to turn from, and I know, Kim, like you're talking about always looking for issues that are going to catch national attention, that was going to turn from an interesting, Tennessee political story into something that was actually going to catch everybody, not just national, but I mean international attention?
If I'm remembering correctly, the shooting occurred on March 27th. That Monday, after the shooting, when the Tennessee Three approached the well without permission, I believe it was that night, or it was the following week. Let's see, it was a couple days after the shooting, they approached the well. That Monday was when immediately word was spreading that they were pulling papers to expel them. And I remember thinking, I think this is real. Like at the very least, like we need to be paying attention to this. And I remember messaging my editor and saying, we should have prep immediately for this. And like, I'm not saying this is going to happen. This is unprecedented. This is historic, but we probably, the tone in here is not dismissive. And I think he was very receptive. My team was very receptive, being like, yes, like everyone's elevated on it. But I think there was still kind of like, no, like, this is not actually going to happen. Cooler heads will prevail, largely just because, again, just expulsion is such a drastic step that Tennessee has in the past not normally done. And across the country, we see it very rarely used, except for, some pretty serious crimes. And so I think it was within pretty soon, again, just that tone of being like, oh no, like people are pretty upset here, people are fired up. But I think then immediately, once the expulsion resolutions were actually filed, and then it just took off like wildfire. I think we're seeing that interesting tension of when one political party has a supermajority and has so for comfortable for years, that they can kind of do whatever they want and without much pushback. I mean, and they can kind of dismiss saying, well, yeah, okay, Nashville people are upset, but we represent the whole state, so the whole state's behind us. And you had in just this particular bottle of just being like, no, maybe maybe some people in the state are maybe behind you, but this you now have the entire country watching you, which is, it was pretty wild to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kim's right. The protest is, it is funny that the Tennessee Three has become the sort of title. It's one of those typical things in journalism where somebody coined this phrase, and then at first it was like the group that has become known as the Tennessee Three, and then later on it becomes Tennessee Three in quotation marks, and at some point it just becomes the Tennessee Three on every reference, and everyone knows what we're talking about. It's fun to see the evolution of these things. There's some argument, of course, that this was the backing band for Johnny Cash, and that Johnny Cash would be sort of upset that his legacy would be sort of usurped in this way, but that's neither here nor there. Yes, it was a Thursday. The protest happened, and the three lawmakers went to the well, and they were started talking in a megaphone and banging on the table and shouting, leading the gallery in chants. Speaker Sexton calls a recess, and they had, as I recall, like a 20-minute plus confab on the balcony outside behind the House chamber, which they wouldn't let reporters out onto, in sort of a reprise of what happened during the 2019 voucher vote, when Glenn Cassata was trying to get any member to flip to keep the voucher bill from failing on the floor, and eventually got Knoxville's Jason Zachary to switch from no to yes, and the thing passed. Usually reporters can go out there on the balcony anytime they want. I tend to hide out there as they're doing their welcoming and honoring things, and is just hanging out and waiting for the action to begin. But it's interesting to see them sort of, physically block reporters from doing their jobs when the chips are down. Lawmakers, I heard several lawmakers were incensed, and they wanted to immediately begin with expulsion movements, and cooler heads prevailed. And going into the weekend, the word was, well, look, let's try to censure them. Let's take other steps and take away their speaking privileges, do something else, which, might have still been bad, but like wouldn't have sort of blown up as much as throwing them out entirely did. Over the weekend, something changed, and Sexton took a much more hardcore. I mean, he came back to the podium right afterwards and said, look, we're all upset. Everyone needs to calm down. Let's try to take it easy. And it seemed like the cooler heads were prevailing. Over the weekend, he goes on talk radio and describes this as being akin to the January 6th events at the U.S. Capitol, and a riot, and the lawmakers were in danger, and just vastly, vastly exaggerated. We were all there. Kim and I were there. I mean, there was no riot. Yes, people were outside and they were upset. It's mostly children and their mothers, demanding gun reform. And they may not like the message, but it certainly was not in any way violent or intimidating or an incursion into the house. But then by the time Monday rolls around, the tables had turned, and next thing you know, this was the ouster provisions, and they're going to go through with it. I didn't think at the time it would get the national legs that it did, because it's a state house, one of 50 in the country, and there's always wacky things happening in all of them, and it's hard to break through that clutter. I covered the ouster of Jeremy Durham, the state lawmaker from Franklin, who had gotten in trouble and allegedly was involved in sexual misconduct with 22 women, including interns and staffers at the legislature. in 2016, and he was thrown out, and we got some national attention for it. My stories with the AP at the time went out on the national wire, and there was some TV news coverage. Nothing anywhere nearing what happened on this, where Donald Trump was getting indicted in New York, and like CNBC, the business channel, not MSNBC, but CNBC was covering live footage of the House ouster proceedings in Nashville, and I've just never seen this sort of national attention from across the board, and international as well, that we had for that event. And I'm not sure what set that off. I mean, there's obviously racial elements, and there's political elements, and also the gun violence, and whatever it was got all stirred up, and just got this incredible focus nationally. And then also the experience in the Statehouse was, we had all these reporters for all the people that work at the Statehouse and people that don't usually work there. And our press room, which is usually we usually have 5 to 10 people during the session, maybe 12 if we're lucky, and the place was just overflowing. You had literally had to walk over people's legs to get to your cube, and there's photographers and chatter, and it's incredible energy, and it was great. And then when it sort of died down, I sort of had a second thought about it, saying, God, I wish we had this kind of feeling about other issues that come up in here, and not just about the one issue that is going to be a flash in the pan nationally. Just naturally, it's going to be that way because attention gets focused elsewhere. But it was a real vibrant and exciting time to be there, just to physically be in the room, because it was teeming with journalists, and that was fun to see.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, just what the experience for both of you was. I mean, this is your beat. This is where you show up every day, and suddenly everybody's there, the national and international. Like, what was it like sort of dealing with these sort of, the people who are literally flying in for the story? How did that change the reporting atmosphere?
I'm the chair of the Capitol Press Corps Association, and so I did actually a lot of interacting with some of the reporters who were flying in, and I have a lot of empathy for reporters who have to just like literally parachute in like this, because I've had to do it as an AP reporter, go into a community that I know nothing about, and relying, hitting up the local reporter there on the ground. So I think I'm always more bodies, more reporting is always going to be a good thing. Also, but like, stay focused on what I need to do, focus on my job, my sources, my priorities. That doesn't change. And, a couple, having more camaraderie in the press room, being able to bounce ideas off of, kind of discuss different angles, seeing, I also think like sometimes people flying in or driving in, they're going to have fresh eyes, and they're going to see things that maybe have become normal for us because we're in and day out, and all of a sudden somebody's offhanded comment, or just a look of something is going to add to that conversation. So I think that those are all good things. But yes, like, they left. I mean, if you remember, the Tennessee 3 expulsion hearings happened shortly afterwards, 2 days afterwards. The Montana legislature is voting to expel a representative, very similar in the same vein, and many of those reporters were flying out to Montana to figure out that representative over there. And so but I think that added to this focus, again, when I talk about Statehouse reporting, is not just covering the bills, it's covering democracy. It is covering how our government is working, and how our representatives, our lawmakers, are working to affirm or undermine or limit, and like how, just what these themes are. And so I think it was just another reminder that this topic gets really hard. I'm not trying to get on a soapbox or anything. It's really hard, but like, this is the moment where, yeah, like, this called for it, because this was historic. This was important to just talking about just how our country works when it comes to electing representatives and officials, and like how our government works. We need as many eyeballs on that when people are looking to maybe silence or undermine elections. And so, to me, more national press on that, the better.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a couple of questions from audience members here. One, and Kim, this kind of goes to talking about what you were saying about how a lot of the bills that we see in Tennessee are also being introduced in other states at the same time. And the question was, is it important in talking about legislation to try to explain where it comes from? I mean, he cited ALEC, which of course is one source we know of a lot of more conservative bills. But how important is it to provide that context to people so that you understand that this bill isn't just something that was cooked up by somebody in, Maury County or whatever?
I think it's incredibly important. I think it doesn't have to be, if you miss it on the first reporting of like, hey, this idea, here's this bill introduction, it passed out of committee. But I think again, it's just so important to be like, okay, how many other states have this same bill? How many are having this exact same language? What group? And lawmakers really don't love to admit that maybe they just got a copy and paste language. They can be a little cagey, and so you usually have to kind of press them or show them like this is the exact same language that's showing up in other bills before they might say, well, I talked to someone about it. But they hold some of those cards really close to their chest about where a bill can come from. And so we're not trying to do gotcha here, but it is good context of like, who are lawmakers paying attention to? Who are the influencers? And who I think that just adds another critical layer to helping show people that these things don't happen in a vacuum, and that we are all interconnected here, and that one thing that happens off an offshoot, you can look for patterns, and you can look at how our system is working.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's the national influence and the sort of national groups that want to bring in this sort of model legislation, as they call it. But then there's also the more sort of mundane local things, and sometimes Kim points out, lawmakers don't want to admit that they didn't come up with these ideas. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they're like, well, they get up and say, this bill was brought to me by the realtors, or this bill was brought to me by the home builders, whoever. And they're sort of unashamed about saying, this bill was given to me by a lobbyist, and here it is, And then the corollary to that is when there's questions, they say, well, can we just bring up this lobbyist to testify to committee and just tell us about it? And it's sort of like the lobbyist has essentially written the bill and is now testifying on behalf of the bill. And then lawmakers, a lot of times, either approve it or I guess don't, depending what it is. But yeah, I think it's important to know who's influencing these things. And these ideas aren't just the altruistic brain children of our august lawmakers. That they're doing the bidding of some special interest group that wants something done, and it doesn't mean all of it's evil. It doesn't, or any of it's evil. It just means that these things have motivations, and it's best to know what they are, rather than just operating in the dark.
Yeah, probably you guys, I'm sure, have had the experience I have of watching a committee hearing, and there's a question about some specific language in a bill, and the sponsor maybe seems a little bit unfamiliar with all of the clauses in their own bill,
Yep.
So, another question came from our friend Deborah Fisher at Tennessee Coalition for Open Government. She was just asking, who did coin the Tennessee 3? Do we know who gets credit for that?
I don't have the answer. I remember seeing it on social media, and I was like, well, who's doing this? And
was it the holler? Or
was it the Tennessee holler?
I don't know. I just I feel like that's where I first saw it, but I don't know if I don't think, I'm not trying to take away credit or give credit. I just I saw it on social media, and I feel like I saw it with the holler, so I don't know.
We'll have to ask Justin if he's taking credit for it, and then anyone else argues. It's a good question. I don't know.
Too late to copyright it at this point, I guess. So we are just a month and a half away here or so from the legislature returning. Can both of you tell me what you expect to see in two different realms? One is how it will be run, because I feel like we saw in the special session over the summer, there were some measures put in place where clearly the leadership was kind of trying to guard against some of the things that happened in the previous session with, public access and so forth. So how tight a ship do you think they're going to try to run? But then also, what are the major issues on the horizon? We're already hearing things about school vouchers, for example. Like, what are the things that you all are expecting to be spending a lot of time on in the coming months?
Yeah, I mean, the security measures were really something else, right? So yes, there's something weird about the Tennessee Capitol, maybe just the layout or just the history. I don't know, in that you know access to the building has been relatively open. If you go through security, you can go in there, or you could traditionally. And a lot of folks, protesters and others, would stand out in the hallway and sort of shout at lawmakers or bang drums or make noise. And it sort of rubbed a lot of lawmakers the wrong way, especially because they don't like being challenged by anybody in general, let alone by regular citizens who want to have their voices heard. What happened then during the special session is they imposed these new rules that basically banned anyone but lawmakers, staffers, and I guess the handful of journalists that have the hard cards, the people that work in the press room, from using the hallway connecting the Cordell Hull office building with the actual Capitol. Everyone else, including lobbyists and whatnot, had to go trump up the stairs and go in through the building itself. And then they put up all these cordons around the lobby outside of the chambers, and basically kept all the public well away from any lawmakers. So there's these big open expanses where lawmakers could traipse through, and they would never have to interact with anybody. Special session was specifically about public safety issues. It doesn't include a lot of lobbying, traditional, paid lobbyists, business lobbyists, and others. And so the lobbying community kind of kept took a step back and didn't really complain too much. I imagine that if they try to do the same again, and I guess the jury's still out what's going to happen in the general session, lobbyists are going to get pretty agitated about not being able to contact or to buttonhole their favorite lawmaker to push their agenda. And while it shouldn't matter what lobbyists think, it does, because they command a lot of campaign contributions, and they have a lot of influence with lawmakers where it matters most in terms of the reelection campaigns. And I guess it'll be interesting to see whether the interest in keeping lobbyists happy will also keep the public getting the public more access as well. You mentioned some of the big issues. I don't want to put Kim on the spot here, but I guess in the interest of time, I'll let her sort of tackle what she thinks are going to be the big issues here beyond vouchers.
Yeah, I mean, the statewide push for vouchers, that's already been mentioned briefly, but it wasn't that long ago where we were just implementing, and whether or not it wasn't that long ago, the court just recently said that program was legal. And we're in the middle still of a pilot project or pilot program for that voucher idea, and that's still ongoing. So there's been a lot of turnover since the bill was passed in 2019. Hard to say that there's we'll see, I guess, on that one. I'm very interested because I cover Tennessee politics and the Statehouse, but I focus a lot on abortion. Senator Briggs said that he was not done looking at Tennessee's abortion ban, and said that he was still talking about ways to maybe tweak it to give maybe more leniency to doctors who maybe feel very constrained and about legal concerns and legal ramifications about the bill. After we saw how that debate went down last year, earlier this session, I don't know if there's how much more of an appetite there is, particularly with an ongoing lawsuit right now with that particular bill. But let's see, abortion's going to be, voucher's going to be an issue. It's going to be an election year, so people are going to be finding their flashy things, but there's going to be also probably pressure to just get in and get out of there because they can't raise money lawmakers can't raise money while they're in session and while their opponents can. So there's always going to be pressure, but there's also going to be flashpoints. We're going to be looking at whether or not there will be any sort of gun control, conversations. The governor has really backed off on saying that he will introduce a red flag law, as we saw with the special session. But, will there be with this latest, there's been a couple cases that I think Speaker Sexton has been laying blame for the Senate for not taking up more bills during special session. For some certain crimes, and the death of the tragic death of that young Belmont student. There will be, I think, an interesting conversation about criminal justice, looking at either harsher penalties or looking at ways to involuntarily commit people regarding mental health. So I think that that's going to be another big messy topic. The covenant parents, the covenant community has said that they're not done. So I'm very curious to see like how they show up. There were one of the bills that did gain a little bit of traction was about closing autopsies of children who had died from violent deaths. And, that was a really tough bill. Ultimately, again, the Senate refused to pick that one up, but I believe that they are, that fight also is not, those conversations are still, being held. So I hope like that's not overly broad. It's interesting to talk about revenue too. Like we're kind of like the teaming down of revenues. We've seen, always beating expectations. As we're having these conversations about revenues are coming a little bit more tame for Tennessee. We're having this conversation about whether or not to reject federal funding for education. I think that's still TBD on like how aggressive we're going to be this year on that topic. But the conversations are those arguments, presentation, I literally was just closing out of my screen watching the federal funding education task force to come on this. Those conversations are ongoing. Now that's a huge messy, how does that even happen conversation, but that's going to pop up, and at least it's going to be part of the conversation for next year.
Just to tack on real quick, on the revenue side, I think Kim's right that that there's that question about rejecting the federal funding, but there's also the general fund revenues that have been easing. We've had this incredible bonanza of tax collections dating back to even before the pandemic, but especially during the pandemic as people were ordering more items online, and the new online sales tax that is fully in effect now, and the state has just been rolling in the cash. The annual tradition by the state funding board is to set revenue projections really low, and then any money that's collected above that is then considered surplus, one-time money that could be spent on all sorts of goodies, including the new $500 million, the $500 million toward the Nashville football stadium, and also stadium in Knoxville, the baseball stadium, the Randy Boyd project, and others. This year, it looks like maybe the pessimistic predictions will come true, and revenues actually will be lower than expected. In which case, lawmakers are going to have to readjust their view on what they can do and how much they can spend, and it could affect major policy positions, sort of including things like the truth in sentencing initiatives to sort of jail people longer than they currently are, which costs money. Every day in prison costs X amount of money, and then someone's got to find where that money's coming from. So I think that's gonna cast a wide shadow over this session on the financial side, and might influence what they can do, and should give them all the more impetus to wrap it up and go home early. But of course, we hope that every year, and it doesn't always happen. So we'll see. Hope springs eternal, and we'll see what happens this year.
All right. Well, coming right up against our sign-off time here. So I want to thank both of you very much for joining us today. And also, as somebody who tries to pay attention to what's going on in Nashville for both professional and personal reasons, I want to thank you very much for your work, because I rely on it tremendously to know what's going on over there. And I think a lot of people in our part of the state do as well. So thanks again. And I'll turn it back over to Maria, our president of the ETSBJ chapter, to take us out.
That was a fantastic forum. Kim and Erik, thank you for your time. I want to point out once again how skilled you both are. Longtime journalists. Erik, of course, with the AP for years now with the Tennessee Journal. Kim is now working for AP. The work you do is vital. The work you do is necessary. And I promise you, a lot of us are reading it. And now I have another book to add to my list to buy. So support authors. Erik has a book. Erik, let's hear one more time. What's the book?
Welcome to Capitol Hill, 50 Years of Scandal in Tennessee Politics from Vanderbilt
Perfect.
University Press.
Sounds like a good read for especially for those who follow politics. Jesse, great job as always. Appreciate you moderating. I will go ahead and end the live video now. Thank you again. And we will be watching closely come January. Get plenty of rest because I think you're in for another one.
Thank you.
Thank you.